Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is a presentation that I'm kind of jumping the gun on, just to get the information out there and to see if there are other people around who are, you know, also speculating, researching the same things that I am. Uh, so, uh, the original name of this presentation is Graham Hancock Exposed, but in my research into the organizations that he's affiliated with, I found a lot more threads to latch onto, and I realized that if I don't put this video out pretty soon, then it might be way too long or way too tenable with way too large of concepts. So yeah, without further ado, this is how it all started. I was really into Graham Hancock, his whole thing about ancient architecture and the pre-civilizations and Gnosticism, his whole smoking ayahuasca thing and talking to the Divine Mother. I was so interested, in fact, that I picked up this book, which he's the editor of, called The Divine Spark, Psychedelics, Consciousness, and the Birth of Civilization. Really, really interesting topics there. So, how could I resist? I got this book a couple years ago. I read it. I was super into, the writers who are featured. There's like Dennis McKenna, Rick Doblin, Alex Gray, Nassim Harriman, Rock Razam, a lot of the big names, Rick Strassman, like DMT, the Spirit Molecule. A lot of these writers are featured in this book, which is edited by Graham Hancock. So I was like, oh, I gotta pick it up. I gotta see what it's all about. And a lot of the concepts, led me down the path of, I gotta explore psychedelics. What the hell is society? I'm looking at it from this new way. All of these new concepts, emerging in my mind. I was like, all right, like, this is a pretty cool thing. And I want to go down this path, further and further. And eventually, when you start going down the countercultural path, you come across a man named Jan Irvin. And a few years ago, I heard a podcast where he was featured on a podcast called The Higher Side Chats with Greg Carlwood. I'm sure that's a stage name. But it didn't go well. I'm pretty sure because Carlwood seemed to idolize Terence McKenna, who Jan Irvin was speculating was part of a PSYOP, potential CIA PSYOP, although there's speculation around whether or not McKenna was working for the Mushroom or the CIA. At any rate, this all revolves around this think tank, per se, called the Esalen Institute, where a lot of these guys, like McKenna, Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, proponents of the New Age movement, have spoken. So, what really propelled me to do this presentation was the fact that this book, The Divine Spark, is published by a company called the Disinformation Company. And after I saw this video by Matthew North called Joe Rogan Exposed, which I highly recommend you watch, although it is very long. It requires a little bit of patience, like all these things kind of do. I was really compelled to look a little bit further into the Disinformation Company. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to pull up this book on Amazon. We're going to explore a little bit some of the themes, and then we're going to kind of find the common motifs with this Disinformation Company and explore some of the connections there. So this is the Amazon page. I've distilled some of it on here. So this anthology is aimed at all of those who are interested in the connection between consciousness, psychedelics, and the development of humankind. So these themes are very countercultural, and what I've noticed is that oftentimes Hancock books are in the controversial knowledge section at stores like Indigo, Chapters. I don't know what it is in other places. I live in Canada, so it kind of leads me to believe that maybe this is like a controlled opposition, countercultural sort of movement. Anyways, also from the Amazon page, best-selling author Graham Hancock has been writing and speaking about this to audiences worldwide, including a controversial TEDx talk on ayahuasca and DMT, which some call the God molecule. So, we have this video. So you can watch.
After 6 million years of...
Sorry, just going to pan forward a bit.
Around in South Africa and many others have suggested an intriguing and radical possibility, which is that this emergence into consciousness was triggered by our ancestors' encounters with visionary plants and the beginning of shamanism. If you analyze the cave art, there's not time to go into the details here, but there are so many details that make it clear that this was an art of altered states of consciousness, of visions. That plants like the Amanita muscaria mushroom or psilocybin mushrooms appear to have been directly connected with this sudden and radical change. So to investigate this possibility...
All right, so he goes on and on. He talks about the psychedelics, how they were responsible for the evolution of consciousness, and this apparently got him banned from the TEDx network. Although this is like one of the most popular TED Talks, in my opinion, it's the one that seems to pop up on my YouTube recommendations more than any other one, thanks to that algorithm or whatever. So it's just it's just baloney. Like, why? It's not banned in any way, shape, or form, other than maybe from the TEDx network, which definitely doesn't have as much reach as like this YouTube network and the network of people that push forward the DMT, psychedelic evolution of consciousness agenda, like Hancock does. So yeah, it's just important to kind of take note of that. Although this was a banned TED Talk, it's really, really popular, and I don't believe for one second that it wasn't supposed to be banned to make it seem edgy. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, anyways, this guy, he talks worldwide. He charges money for tickets in sold out stadiums. I actually saw him in Toronto. He spoke on psychedelics and the birth of consciousness, civilization. It was a really interesting talk at the time, before I started to see all of these sorts of themes. I still find it really interesting, actually. And, to a punk like me, it's really interesting that this website, Celebrity Net Worth, I guess he is a very popular speaker and author and journalist and whatever, but this website features his net worth at $2 million. So he's a mover, he's a shaker, he's a businessman. He's not just some guy trying to get the information out. I always find that, like, when people are paid for the information which they provide, there's a certain amount of doubt, skepticism, which emerges alongside that, which is why I have a tendency to trust people like Jan Irvin and Matthew North, and people that are just researching for the sake of research, which is what I'm doing as well. I'm not really sold any one way on any theory, but it's interesting to explore these avenues and to see what comes up. So yeah, Hancock, he talks to audiences at length and includes a lot of information about DMT. He's a rich countercultural figure, and it's really interesting that, like, you can draw a lot of similarities between Jordan Peterson, for example, who speaks about religion, about all of these themes, archetypes, Jungian archetypes, and even does mention certain shamanic motifs and things about DMT in some of his speeches. And although he's seen as somebody who is part of the intellectual dark web, it's sort of like a countercultural thing to listen to Jordan Peterson. He's very well off as well, and in no way really represents the countercultural force. Anyways, back This is also taken from the Amazon page of this book. Graham Hancock leads the charge in this collection of the latest thinking on consciousness, with a particular focus on the use of psychedelics to open up the realm of the supernatural. Leading minds and radical thinkers, including McKenna, Doblin, Gray, Russell Brand, and Rick Strassman, illuminate the topic like this never before. Yeah, we kind of went over that. So there you have it. We know he's in this network with all of these movers and shakers: Dennis McKenna, Rick Doblin, Rick Strassman, all these kind of maps associated figures. These guys are featured on the Joe Rogan podcast quite a bit, and in Matthew North's video, he does explore maps where they receive their funding, where the Rogan podcast receives their funding, how all of these people are kind of part of this intersecting network. And you should definitely go explore that Joe Rogan exposed video, and as well as the work of Jan Irvin on LogosMedia. They do a great job of illuminating that information. But just to get it out there for you, so like I said, this book, The Divine Spark, was published by the Disinformation Company. So we're going to check that out. Disinformation Company, here we go. Yeah, there it is. There's that little logo. It's got little horns. Really interesting, the whole like devil motif. We'll get into that a little bit later. So Disinformation Company, I saw Matthew North went down, and yeah, he showed this one. Endgame is a film written by Alex Jones, so that's really interesting. So you know Alex Jones and Graham Hancock, part of the same like Disinformation Company, or at least, you know, have ties to it. And then you can look up this guy, Matt Staggs, key person in the Disinformation Company. You look him up on Google, because there's no link. And then you get his Twitter. And then you can see Matt Staggs, the very first thing he writes about himself, JRE, Joe Rogan Experience Talent Booker. Yeah. So, Graham Hancock, Joe Rogan, Alex Jones, all in the same Disinformation Network. Really, really, really interesting. There's a few connections that Matthew North made in his video with Channel 4 in Britain, which is also a really, really interesting thread, considering Jordan Peterson had that famous interview on Channel 4 with Kathy Newman, I think it was. I don't know, that's not really the theme of this video, but it's definitely worth exploring. So, you know, if you do watch this and you feel like going down that avenue, there's the start of the thread for you. So, we're going to keep going on this. It's clear that these networks are infiltrated, and whether or not the specific individuals have been compromised, the cut of their jib aligns with the Esalen Institute agenda of creating a one-world religion and a global citizen based on the use of psychedelics within the framework of totalitarianism. Very similar to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the whole agenda of medicated population, all happy, kind of contrasted to George Orwell's 1984, which, you know, represents a slave class kind of suffering and being very confused. It's, you know, this whole idea of you know, legalizing psychedelics and allowing the masses of the population to consume them in order to medicate them, especially like things like PTSD from war. It's I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing in that sense. Especially not when the substances are controlled by, you know, big pharma, things like that. So it's really interesting that you can see a lot of these threads emerge in literature. Another publishing company that I'm aware of that had Rockefeller funding was the Lucis Trust, which published a ton of books on the New Age. It used to be called the Luciferian Trust, but then they changed it, I guess, because it was a little bit too creepy to a lot of people. And it's really, really interesting, this whole like angle of Luciferianism and like what that even means. I guess because Lucifer was the light bearer in traditional like biblical theology, history, like whatever. So what the thread which emerges with all of this like information about DMT is you know, once this stuff gets out to the masses, I really do believe that there's going to be like a one world religion which emerges, and it seems as though all of these people are really obsessed with Gnosticism. So I have this video of Graham Hancock on Gnosticism and Joe Rogan. I'll show right now. It's a few minutes, so.
And shut it all down again. I mean, I know you're not big into supernatural issues, but when I look at all of this, I have to say, the Gnostics, who, if I simplify the Gnostic ideas, we know about Gnostic ideas because a batch of texts were found buried at a place called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, near the Temple of Dendera in Upper Egypt, and they'd been buried for 1,600 years, and they were found in 1945, and they contain a complete corpus of ideas of a people who call themselves the Gnostics, and they see a dark force at work in the universe, which is seeking to snuff out the divine spark in humanity, and it's a supernatural force. And what they say is that the entity who we've been taught for the last 2,000 plus years to believe is God, the God of Abraham, who may be called Yahweh or who may be called Allah, that from the Gnostic point of view, that's not a god at all. That's a demon. That's a lower level supernatural who's got this huge inflated ego, who wants to be praised and worshipped, who's constantly urging his followers on to acts of violence and war. And I think we cannot say there are any facts in this area. Maybe it's just the dark side of the human psyche, and maybe it's all generated by our brains, or maybe there is a supernatural realm. But I think Gnosticism is a very useful tool to look at the society we live in today. They believed that there were entities called archons, who are evil angels who disguise themselves as human beings and mingle with us to drive us into all manner of crimes and behavior that is hostile to the nature of the soul. And that's what I see happening everywhere. But they believed fundamentally we are good, and that we have this light within us, and that the way to reveal that light is through knowledge. That's why the serpent in the Garden of Eden is the good guy in the Gnostic frame of reference.
Well, that's very bizarre, the serpent being the good guy.
He's the good guy because he's saying to Adam and Eve, you have to know the difference between good and evil. You can't just be these thoughtless meat creatures, who are wandering around in a happy daze in the garden. If you're going to grow and develop, you have to make choices between good and evil. And it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil that the serpent introduces Adam and Eve to, and says you need to eat from that. And actually, I would say this is true. We do need to. We are defined by our choices. It's through our choices that we grow. And if we're ignorant of the context, how can we hope to grow?
Yeah, and the stories of like Adam and Eve and all that stuff. It's allegorical, right? I mean, it's supposed to be. There's an allegory to.
There's certainly an allegory.
All right. So, whoa. First of all, pretty much sounded like he wants us to eat the fruit, to learn good and evil, whatever that is. I don't know. I draw a lot of comparisons between the apple in the Garden of Eden, and DMT containing plants. A lot of people have like visions which contain serpents in their DMT visions. I speculate whether or not maybe that's a higher dimensional representation of like what a human looks like over the course of their life. They walk, they leave behind a trail, or maybe it represents like Jeremy Narby has this whole cosmic serpent concept, where DNA is represented by the serpent. I'm not really sure if it has anything to do with like genetic manipulation. It's fun to think about. But yeah, so that video is really interesting, talking about Gnosticism, talking about kind of where we're at as a society, because everybody kind of wants to take the pill, for lack of a better term, and like everybody wants to do psychedelics, everybody wants to smoke weed. These things are becoming popular, these things are becoming legal. Back to these notes here. Graham constantly cites Gnosticism as the religion in which he has found the most truth, where in a reversal of Abrahamic religion, where traditional god Yahweh Allah is actually the negative entity known as the demiurge. So it's really interesting. So they're antagonizing the traditional god. Graham is also a proponent of ayahuasca and speaks very highly of his experience and how it whipped him into shape, admonishing him for his weed-smoking habits. He speaks very highly of the divine feminine. So this is the concept which emerges with a lot of these like psychedelic people, the divine feminine, which obviously has its counterpoint in the divine masculine, and then enter Jordan Peterson. So this is really, really interesting. This is a video which I came across a little while ago, and I was really, really shocked to see him bring this up at the beginning of, I'm pretty sure it was his Cain and Abel biblical lecture. Anyways, we're going to watch this video.
So I'm going to read you something. I get a lot of mail, and I don't know where I got this. I've been a lot of different places in the last week, and this showed up at one of them, and I'm going to read it to you. I have no idea what to make of it. It's written in a female hand, so that's about all I can tell, but there's no address or name on it. This isn't a question, but a comment, or more accurately, perhaps, a message. I spent this past weekend in an ayahuasca ceremony, which for those of you who don't know, is a South American visionary plant medicine. Some of you may roll your eyes at this, but ayahuasca brings you into direct contact with the archetypal realm of being. Users of this medicine, initiates I should say, refer to ayahuasca as she, because the spirit of the plant is decidedly feminine. An encounter with ayahuasca is an encounter with the great mother of creation, the goddess, the void from which all things come, the feminine counterpart of Logos. Dr. Peterson, you appeared in one of my ayahuasca visions. Might account for why I've been rather fatigued lately. Dr. Peterson, you appeared in one of my ayahuasca visions, and I asked her, who is Jordan Peterson? What is he doing? Which is something I'd really like to know as well. And she responded with crystalline clarity, quote, "Here, he is here to invoke and initiate the divine masculine principle on earth at this time." So I'm up here to thank you deeply and profoundly on behalf of the Great Mother herself, the goddess, the divine feminine principle, who has been eagerly awaiting the awakening of the masculine principle into divinity and service. So, you don't get a letter like that every day. Actually, I get a letter or two like that every day.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, buddy. Okay. So that's really, really interesting. Why would he read that letter at the beginning of a biblical lecture unless he wanted to spread knowledge about ayahuasca to people who are devout Christians? People who have interest in the Bible and, you know, can't find any good information in their church, so you know, they go on the internet and that's the first thing they find. It's like, boom, you learn about ayahuasca. And I don't know, it's really, really interesting, considering this whole thing with the serpent giving the fruit which reveals the knowledge, and this whole thing with you know, knowledge being equated to light, in the sense which, you know, the sun illuminates the darkened things so we can see their truth, and this whole concept of Lucifer being the light bearer. I just find it really, really interesting that, you know, Christians are falling for this. I guess one way or another they're falling for something. So Peterson intentionally exposes ayahuasca at the beginning of his biblical lecture series. He deconstructs the Bible in the Joseph Campbell sense, which is really, really interesting. He's claimed, you know, he breaks it down in a way where you can derive moral from the story. You can see the classic archetypes like emerge in the stories, the biblical stories, and it's a very effective way of breaking down the Bible. It's much more effective than literalism, which is just, it just makes me cringe a lot of the time, but hell, what do I know? Anyways, he stated he has the intentions to do the exact same thing with the Quran, and it's really important to note that a lot of JP's ideas are just distillations of other thinkers like Jung, Freud, Joseph Campbell. This is where it's kind of interesting for me, because Joseph Campbell specifically has a memorial page on the Esalen Institute website. So we can see that he was definitely involved in the page. I'm not even going to read it, but it's important to note that he was involved with Esalen. And again, if you haven't read or heard anything about Esalen, go study the work of Jan Irvin, Matthew North. Both these guys, they break it down in detail, whereas I'm just going to give you a quick. Again, this breakdown of biblical concepts into that of applicable moral advice allows for wider accessibility and looser interpretation for all holy texts, and beckons the emergence of one world religion. Yeah, so when he said that he was going to do it with the Quran, we can only imagine, we have Christianity and Islam kind of facing off right now in North America. Once people are, able to see their Bibles as, these sort of like, stories with morals rather than things to be taken literally, like the Word of God, like just interpretations. And with Graham Hancock's whole angle too, is these stories are all derived from older stories, which very well could be true. It probably is true. In fact, it makes a lot of sense. So it's interesting, we're seeing this deconstruction, which is going to create unity. And I find the younger generations who are more, internet savvy, they come across these things where it's the parents of these kids who are real religious fanatics. A lot of the younger people aren't. So we're going to show this Jordan Peterson video on Gnosticism real quick.
Do you believe there's a strong undercurrent of Gnosticism in our country? Gnosticism, by the way, is the doctrine, heretical doctrine from a classical Christian perspective, that you can attain religious insight through understanding. That's a oversimplified view, but things like the sacred feminine and hatred of the created world. God, that's a complicated question. I think that there's an undercurrent of wannabe Gnosticism in our country. I think that people believe they can come to religious enlightenment through understanding, but that they're generally less willing to do the work that would be necessary to do that than is in fact necessary. It takes an awful lot of study. Like, it took me years of reading Jung to really start to understand what he was talking about. And you could think about Jung as a Gnostic, but most people who talk about Jung haven't read anything he wrote. Well, that's true often of things that people talk about in general. But I think there is a place for understanding in religious belief, or otherwise I wouldn't be doing this biblical lecture series. But I think it's pseudo-Gnosticism fundamentally, and it's people putting forward ill-considered opinions in the place of solid religious symbolic doctrine. And I think that's a big problem. I think it's part of what makes us weak, and I think we are at the moment weak in our foundations as a civilization.
So, pretty much there, what we can see is he's talking about, a lot of people are really hollow with their religious beliefs, specifically in terms of Gnosticism, and it kind of freaks me out just a little bit, because like if people aren't studying these things very, very deeply, and they're dismantling their previous religious views and things like that, things that were rooted in tradition, then you're going to be kind of left empty. And whatever emerges, if it is Gnosticism, it's quite strange. The whole fact that your God is now your devil and Lucifer is this light bearer, and I don't know. So Jordan knows that most people have no idea what Jung is talking about. So we won't be able to put in the work required to integrate the traditional psychedelic revelations. What about modern psychedelia is traditional? This is something worth looking at. I believe that when psychedelics are prescribed by medical physicians, that a lot of people are just going to take them and they're not going to be able to do the spiritual work that's required, to make proper use of them. I am a strong proponent of psychedelics when used properly, but I don't think that this medical setting or the setting in which they're prescribed is going to do any good for humanity. I think that people are just going to be more easily molded by the television, by the internet, by Facebook, by all of those things. So the future that we're looking at is not one which will involve the archaic revival in the complete sense, Terence McKenna's archaic revival. The future that we're looking at is more reminiscent of Huxley's Brave New World, depicting a happily medicated population under complete control. The settings for such drug use will not be traditional. Hospital settings reminiscent of MK Ultra, if you're not familiar with those experiments, the experiments of Ewan Cameron at McGill University. He did a lot of stuff with shock therapy, psychedelics, isolation, stripping people of their identity, trying to build a Manchurian candidate. People are going to be taking psychedelics in these hospital settings, not in nature. And same thing with the urban cityscapes. People are going to be taking psychedelics in urban cityscapes, and they're going to be seeing these densely populated areas, and it's going to feel unnatural. But once they're kind of completely broken down, then they can be built up again, and they can see everything around them as natural. So these drugs will be used to create better soldiers tolerant to any amount of violence. Will be dosed day in, day out with MDMA. That's the whole thing with soldiers being prescribed MDMA. When they have PTSD, they come home from war. Just dose them, like, it's fine. Like, better soldiers. So I believe that the end game is peace via a one world religion. Once the battle of polarities is over, Christianity, Islam, what will emerge is this kind of one world religion, which goes aligned with the whole view of radical centrism. This thread that Jan Irvin and Matthew North pull on quite a bit. A lot of people think this might be a good thing, to have a religion based in the psychedelics, but I speculate that it probably won't be a good thing. Even R. Gordon Wasson is noted to have regretted bringing mushrooms into such popularity via his Time Life magazine interview or write-up. It's quite likely that a monopoly of control will be put into place by Big Pharma. We're going to have a celebrity priest class consisting of Hancock, Peterson, Joe Rogan, all of these people that have a lot of money. They're going to be the ones that are able to explore these psychedelic avenues fully, and everybody's going to have an awareness of what these psychedelic avenues involve. So we're going to be able to take them seriously while, probably not being able to access it in any legal sense ourselves without first going through the institutions. So, I'm just going to explore a little bit of Esalen Institute. So, again, you can find more details in the work of Jan Irvin and Matthew North. These guys are indispensable to this kind of research. Esalen Institute, on ancient ground, opening new horizons, pioneering deep change in self and society. Deep change. Unparalleled intellectual history, look beyond dogma to explore deeper spiritual possibilities, forge new understandings of self and society, pioneer new paths for change. So, yeah, we can see, arguably we're not doing so well as a society, so, maybe this is a good thing, but it's really, really strange when there are government-funded psyops, because a lot of the times there are ulterior motives involved, and, that's never good. So, Graham Hancock is quite aware of the Esalen Institute. I actually found in this Esalen catalog 07B, he has this whole article in which he's featured began his writing career, blah blah blah. It's just kind of like a little biography thing right here. But it's interesting to note that he is involved with this organization. There are write-ups on him available. I just found this, through the website, through a quick Google search. So he is involved with this organization. But I also found this whole thing where he actually is trying to specifically call people out for trying to discredit him, and also the work of Terence McKenna. It's not even that no one's trying to discredit him. What we're really trying to do is expose the fact that he's part of this organization, which has funding and has an agenda, which is being, it's being manifested by the people. You can see it like pretty much everywhere in Toronto. Like a lot of the themes of the Joe Rogan podcast are emerging. Like people are trying this all beef diet. And people are talking about psychedelics left and right. Sorry, I don't know why this is so slow. Oh yeah, here we go. So here's this huge rant Hancock posted. Terence McKenna used language with the utmost brilliance, but even he can't defend himself from beyond the grave. So those of us who care about his work... Oh. Just a second here. And his incredible legacy of free thinking and new ideas have an obligation to speak out for him. Over the past few months, I've become aware of an insidious hate campaign being waged against Terence across the internet. A campaign based on rumor and disinformation suggesting that he was a CIA/FBI agent. So, I'm not sure if anyone's actually saying that. Maybe Jan is saying that. But it seems to me, based on the evidence that has been provided, or at least the evidence that I've seen so far, that it's vague. He spoke of it in a conference that they started working for them. And, Dennis was like, oh, he's definitely just working for them. But who knows? He was talking at Esalen, which is government funded. So I've noticed that many on the net simply accept the untruths and the heart of this campaign as though they were tried and tested facts without applying critical thinking to what is being said, and then go on to multiply and propagate them further. The most recent examples of this came today when I posted an extract from a lecture Terence gave at a UFO expo in Los Angeles in 1993. So yeah, that's the one where he talks about how he was recruited by them. Look into the work of Jan across the comments. This is what was received. Look into the work of Jan Irvin as he has exposed McKenna's connection to the CIA and the Esalen Institute, where mind control was on the agenda. McKenna is a CIA propagandist. I love listening to Terence, but what are we to make of Jan Irvin's revelation that he was employed in deep background public revelations for the CIA? These are fairly representative of the kinds of remarks that are now frequently made about Terence all over the net, and there is no doubt that as the rumors spread, they have the effect of diminishing his legacy and distracting us from the importance of his insights. So what is this whole story based on? As far as I can see, it's based only on a crass misreading and misinterpretation of certain remarks that Terence made during a lecture he gave at the Esalen Institute in 1994. No, not exactly. It's the fact that he was there at all speaking, and the themes that he's speaking about are relevant to the agenda of the Esalen Institute. So, in the opening seconds we read, recently the great research site GnostiCmedia came across a classic, very rare lecture given by Terence McKenna, speaking at the Esalen Institute in California. Obviously admits that he's been working as an agent for decades, so it's okay, whatever, this is just a bunch of bullshit. While I'm not a cult follower of Terence McKenna, I recognize a great mind. Yeah, he had a great mind. That's, probably why he was speaking at Esalen. It makes a lot of sense. So Hancock just goes on and on and on. Just throwing out these ad hominems lacking in any sense of humor, paranoid frame of mind, of course we're in a paranoid frame of mind. Look at this brave new world that we live in. Constantly surveilled. And, why are these institutions being funded by the organizations that they're being funded? I have to look into that more. I'm so sorry. I should be able to pull up something about that as well. But, so, a lot of people in the comments section are talking about Terence We're talking about Jan. And yeah, like one of the most frightening terms you'll hear is when you start waking up to the Matrix. It's controlled opposition, and everyone who's supposedly waking you up is a government or Illuminati agent trying to steer you down the wrong path. Yeah. So, a lot of these people think it's rather silly. But then you have some rationality in the comments too. These are all just copy and pasted from the comments section. Have you ever read Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan? The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Ken Casey. These things document the CIA's involvement in the psychedelic programs. Same with, MK Ultra experimenting with them, and although just like closing down their operation, starting it up under new names, and operating clandestine. So sorry, this is my first video. My throat is just killing me right now. But what I wanted to do is I was turned on to this letter from a friend of mine. It's Albert Pike's alleged letter to Mazzini. It's disputed whether or not this letter is real. But it's an interesting sort of expose on what was thought at the time, and it reveals an agenda to create 3 world wars. This is just an excerpt from the part about the Third World War, which we are currently experiencing the beginnings of. So, the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the State of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual, and economic exhaustion. Excuse me. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, in which its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. And everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal, but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. So apparently that letter was written in 1871. It's quite relevant now, especially if you think about the themes portrayed in this video. This whole DMT, Gnosticism, Luciferian agenda, which is being pushed forward by the controlled opposition counterculture, intellectual dark web, the Disinformation Network, Joe Rogan Network, Jordan Peterson, Graham Hancock, Alex Jones, all those guys. Not to say that, they're agents themselves, but, they're pushing the agenda. So, what else can I say? I'm going to finish off with this. This is a paper written by Angela Maria Lungu, a major in the U.S. Army, entitled War.com, the Internet and Psychological Operations. Part 5, PSYOP and the Future. Given the strategic opportunities afforded by the Internet, there are several options for employing this medium. DoD in particular could use the Internet offensively to help achieve unconventional warfare objectives, as well as to address and counter adversarial propaganda, disinformation, and neutral party information. Interesting. During the Kosovo crisis, former USIA Chief Information Officer Jonathan Spalter stated the measure of success is the extent to which we are perceived not as propaganda, but anti-propaganda. In addition to websites, preempting messages, and developing internet products such as streaming audio-video, online video games, mediated news groups, and ad banners can also be leveraged for their strategic value and reach. The recent Defense Science Board report on PSYOP also suggested some less obvious potential tools using emerging media technologies such as chat rooms and instant messaging services. So this is obviously a little bit dated, but we can see how social media has been used to push the agenda. that could be used for guided discussions to influence how citizens think about certain topics. And even note that both U.S. presidential candidates and the Chinese government have used similar internet technologies for information dissemination. As we can see right now, there's a huge push to censor conservative views by social media platforms who, are just operating via international law, so it seems, or, they're dictating, they're dictating what people in the United States are able to say online, despite their amendment, which allows them freedom of speech. So that's a really, really interesting letter written by a major in the U.S. Army. And I am pretty sure that all of this conflict is going to result, like, it must come to a head eventually. And what I truly believe is that enough people, after going through the education system in multiculturalism, are going to be so disillusioned with their religious traditions, but not able to let them go, that they're not able to let spirituality as a concept go, that they're going to look for something else. And when they come out of Christianity, or when they finally decide to wake up, as some people put it, they find Rogan, or they find Peterson, or they find the controversial knowledge section at Indigo, and they're led down this path of take psychedelics and it'll fix everything. And it's not necessarily true. And then they begin to obsess over these people's videos and all of the agendas which they push. And I'm not saying that they're bad agendas. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to take psychedelics. But I think that you should be aware of the potential for harm. I'd imagine that getting super high and then watching CNN for like half an hour even could have a lot of negative repercussions. And I just wanted to bring this research to light, and see if anyone has been looking into the same things. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, you can just send a comment, or send me an email directly. I'm really just doing this by myself, not getting paid, just a hobbyist, you could say. So again, look into the work of Jan Irvin at LogosMedia, Matthew North as well, who created the Joe Rogan Exposed video, which is just awesome. It's actually on Logos. It's re-uploaded by Logos Media itself. This has been a presentation by Mitch Langdon, the first one I've ever done. So let's see how this goes. You'll hear from me again if I am not assassinated.